If you sign that, you lose everything. The words didn't just interrupt the room, they cracked it. Crystal glasses paused mid-air. A pen hovered above a $300 million contract like it suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. Every head turned, not toward the investors, not toward the Korean executive seated across the table, but toward her, the waitress no one had noticed 10 seconds ago. Naomi Brooks stood still, one hand resting lightly against the back of a leather chair, her posture calm in a room built on pressure. She wasn't supposed to speak. Not here. Not now. Not to him. Ethan Caldwell didn't lower his pen right away. At 38, he had built Caldwell Dynamics into a billion-dollar empire by trusting numbers, instincts, and the people he paid to be right. And tonight was supposed to be his biggest win yet. A cross-border deal, sold to New York, projected to expand his reach across Asia by nearly 40% in under 18 months. Everything had been checked. Double-checked. His legal team, his analysts, his translator. Especially his translator. Victor Hand stood just behind him, composed, polished, the kind of man who never stumbled over a word. Fluent, precise, invisible when needed. Exactly what Ethan valued. So when a waitress spoke over him, in the middle of a closing moment, he didn't react with confusion. He reacted with irritation. Slow. Controlled. Dangerous. "Excuse me," Ethan said, his voice quiet enough to demand silence without raising it. Naomi didn't flinch. Around her, the room seemed to shrink. The skyline outside the glass walls faded into nothing but blurred lights. The low hum of distant traffic became a background pulse. All that remained was the table, the contract, and the weight of what she had just said. She had been moving between them all night, refilling glasses, clearing plates, adjusting silverware no one noticed was crooked. Invisible. That was the job. Invisible was safe. But invisibility had its advantages. It let you listen. And Naomi had been listening. Every translated sentence. Every clause softened. Every number reframed just slightly enough to pass unnoticed, unless you understood both sides of the conversation. Unless you caught the spaces between words. She shifted her gaze, not to Ethan, but to the document in front of him. "The terms he's giving you," she said, her voice steady, measured, "that's not what they're actually agreeing to." A ripple moved across the table. One of the Korean executives leaned forward slightly. Another exchanged a glance with his colleague. Victor's expression tightened, just for a fraction of a second, before smoothing back into professionalism. "Sir," Victor interjected, calm but firm, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Naomi turned her head then, finally meeting his eyes. There was no hesitation there. No apology. Just certainty. "No," she said quietly. "There hasn't." The air shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But enough. Enough for doubt to slip into a room that had, moments ago, been certain. Enough for a man who had built his empire on control to feel something unfamiliar press against his instincts. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the pen. He hadn't signed yet. Not yet. And for the first time that night, the deal in front of him didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a question. No one moved, but everything shifted. Ethan Caldwell slowly set the pen down on the table, not with hesitation, but with intention, the kind that signaled control even when control was starting to slip. His eyes did not leave the contract, but his attention had already moved elsewhere, recalculating, reassessing, searching for the smallest crack in what had been a flawless night. "Explain," he said, not looking at Naomi, not yet, but the word landed in her direction with weight. Victor stepped forward half a pace, smooth, composed, his voice steady in a way that had reassured rooms like this for years. "Sir, I assure you, the translation has been accurate throughout. We have gone over every clause together. There is no discrepancy." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Confidence, when practiced long enough, sounded like truth. Naomi did not argue immediately. She did not rush to defend herself. Instead, she took a small step closer to the table, just enough to be heard clearly without disrupting the space that had never been meant for her. Her eyes moved across the document, then to the Korean executives, then back to Ethan. Clause 14, she said. The section about distribution rights. One of the Korean partners shifted in his seat, his expression tightening just slightly, the kind of reaction that only someone paying attention would notice. Ethan noticed. Victor responded instantly. That clause has already been clarified, he said, a hint sharper now. It ensures mutual exclusivity within agreed regions. Naomi shook her head once, slow, certain. That is not what they said. Silence pressed in again, heavier this time. Not curiosity. Not confusion. Something closer to doubt. Ethan finally looked at her directly. Not as a waitress. Not as background. As a variable he had not accounted for. Then what did they say? He asked. Naomi did not answer in English. Instead, she turned slightly toward the Korean executives and spoke in fluent Korean, her tone respectful but precise, each word placed with the kind of clarity that did not leave room for interpretation. The reaction was immediate. One executive leaned forward, eyes widening just enough to confirm recognition. Another nodded slowly, his gaze shifting toward Victor. A quiet exchange followed, fast, controlled, but unmistakably different from before. Naomi turned back to Ethan. They are not offering shared distribution, she said. They are asking for full control in Asia for 10 years, with renewal options that favor them, not you. The numbers on the page suddenly felt different. The margins tighter. The upside smaller. The risk heavier. Victor's composure held, but barely. That is an interpretation, he said. A nuanced one, but still aligned with the spirit of the agreement. Naomi's voice did not rise. It is not nuance, she said. It is ownership. The word landed harder than anything before it. Ownership. Not partnership. Not expansion. Control. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, the leather creaking under a shift that, to anyone else, might have looked casual. It was not. It was distance. Space to think. Space to see what he had missed. He looked at the Korean executives now, not through Victor, not through filtered language, but directly, searching for confirmation in expressions instead of words. One of them gave a small, polite smile, the kind used when something uncomfortable had just been understood without being said out loud. That was enough. Ethan's gaze moved back to the contract, then to Victor, and finally to Naomi. The room had not grown louder, but it had grown sharper. Edges where there had been none before. And in the center of it all stood a woman who had been invisible an hour ago, now holding the only version of the truth that mattered. Victor did not step back this time. He held his ground, shoulders squared, voice measured but carrying a sharper edge now, the kind that appears when control begins to feel threatened. With respect, he said, directing his words to Ethan but keeping his eyes on Naomi, language in international agreements often carries layered meanings. Direct translations can sound more aggressive than intended. That does not mean they are inaccurate. Naomi did not respond immediately. She let the silence stretch just long enough for the room to feel it again, that subtle shift from certainty to unease. Her gaze moved once more to the Korean executives, then back to Ethan, as if weighing whether the truth still had room to be heard. Then let them say it, she said quietly. In English. Clearly. That landed differently. One of the executives adjusted his cuff, another leaned slightly toward his colleague, and a brief exchange followed in Korean, this time without Victor's voice guiding it. It was quieter, more cautious. When it ended, the senior partner turned toward Ethan with a polite, practiced smile. There may be some flexibility in interpretation, he said carefully. We can review the language again to ensure mutual understanding. Flexibility. Interpretation. Words designed to soften what had just been exposed. Ethan heard it. Not the words themselves, but what they avoided. He leaned forward again, resting his hands flat on the table, no longer touching the pen. "No," he said, calm but firm. "We are not reviewing anything through interpretation." His eyes shifted to Victor. "Translate exactly what they said. No adjustments." Victor hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but in a room like this, a fraction was enough. "Of course," he replied, but the confidence had thinned. He turned, spoke in Korean, then translated back, slower now, more deliberate. The words came out heavier this time. Less polished. Less reassuring. And exactly as Naomi had described. Full control. Extended term. Renewal advantages weighted to one side. No mention of shared authority. No balance. No partnership? When he finished, the silence that followed was not uncertain. It was clear. Ethan sat back again, this time not to think, but because the answer had already formed. The deal he had been seconds away from signing was not a step forward. It was a surrender dressed in polished language. He exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that does not show panic, only realization. Then he turned his head slightly toward Naomi. "How long have you been listening?" he asked. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "Since the first toast," she said. Since the first time the numbers did not match the tone. There was no pride in her voice. No performance. Just fact. Ethan nodded once, absorbing it, then looked back at the executives across from him. The room still carried its elegance, the skyline still glowed beyond the glass, but something essential had changed. The illusion was gone. "We are done for tonight," he said. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But with finality. Chairs shifted. Papers remained untouched. The momentum that had been building for weeks collapsed in a single sentence. One of the executives began to speak, but stopped when Ethan raised a hand slightly, not to dismiss, but to close the door without force. Victor stepped back now, finally, the distance he had avoided creating itself. And Naomi, still standing where she had been, did not move forward, did not step into the space that had opened. She remained exactly where she had started. The only difference was that now, everyone in the room could see her. No one reached for their glasses anymore. The room that had once moved with quiet confidence now held still, like a machine waiting for a command that would not come. The Korean executives gathered their composure quickly, their professionalism intact, but the subtle shift in posture, the careful choice of words, the absence of urgency, all of it said the same thing without saying it directly. The deal was no longer theirs to control. Ethan Caldwell stood up slowly, not in anger, not in frustration, but in clarity. His chair slid back with a soft sound against the polished floor, the kind that would have gone unnoticed earlier, but now seemed louder than it should have been. He buttoned his jacket with a single, deliberate motion, eyes steady, mind already moving beyond the table. "We will have our legal team review everything independently," he said, his tone calm, final. "If there is still a deal to be made, we will revisit it on different terms." There was no accusation in his voice. No confrontation. Just distance. The kind that powerful people use when they decide something is no longer worth their immediate attention. Across the table, the senior Korean executive inclined his head slightly, respectful, controlled. "Of course," he replied. "We appreciate your thoroughness." It was a polite ending to something that had nearly been irreversible. Papers remained unsigned. Opportunities remained suspended. And for the first time that night, the advantage no longer belonged to them. Victor remained silent. He had stepped back enough to disappear again, but not far enough to escape the weight of what had just unfolded. His expression stayed neutral, but neutrality now looked different. It looked like calculation. It looked like someone measuring consequences that had not existed an hour ago. Ethan did not address him. Not yet. Instead, his attention shifted back to Naomi. She had not moved. Not toward the table. Not away from it. still positioned between presence and absence, as if unsure whether she was meant to remain visible now that the moment had passed. For a second, neither of them spoke. The room gave them that space, whether intentionally or not. Then Ethan took a step toward her, closing the distance just enough to acknowledge her not as staff, but as someone who had altered the outcome of the night. "What is your name?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried a weight it had not carried before. Naomi answered without hesitation. "Naomi Brooks." Ethan nodded once, committing it to memory the way he memorized numbers, projections, decisions that mattered. "You understood everything they said," he continued, not as a question, but as confirmation. Naomi held his gaze. "Yes." There was no embellishment. No explanation. Just truth. Ethan studied her for a moment longer, not trying to figure out who she was, but trying to understand how he had not seen her sooner. A person capable of hearing what others missed, of recognizing patterns hidden beneath polished language, of stepping forward at exactly the moment it mattered most. That was not accidental. That was not luck. That was skill. "Where did you learn Korean?" he asked. Naomi glanced briefly toward the window, the city lights reflecting in her eyes before she answered. "Seoul," she said. "I lived there for 3 years." That answer landed differently. Not because of what it said, but because of what it implied. Experience. Exposure. A life that existed beyond what her uniform suggested. Ethan nodded again, slower this time. The pieces were aligning now, forming a picture that had been invisible only because no one had looked closely enough. Behind him, the room began to move again. Chairs shifted. Quiet conversations resumed. The structure of the evening attempting to rebuild itself around what had just happened. But something fundamental had changed. The hierarchy had been interrupted. The expected roles had been rewritten, not loudly, not dramatically, but with precision. Ethan turned slightly, his voice carrying just enough to reach the table without commanding it. "We are done here," he repeated, softer this time, but no less final. Then he looked back at Naomi, and for the first time that night, there was something in his expression that had not been there before. Not authority. Not calculation. Recognition. Not of her position, but of her value. And in a room built on power, that shift meant more than anything that had been written on the contract. The room did not empty all at once. Power rarely moved that way. It dissolved slowly, in quiet exits and measured gestures, in polite nods that meant something entirely different beneath the surface. One by one, the Korean executives gathered their folders, their expressions composed, their voices low as they exchanged final words that carried no urgency anymore. The momentum was gone. What had been a closing had become a reconsideration, and in rooms like this, that difference was everything. Ethan Caldwell remained standing for a moment longer, watching them leave, not with frustration, but with calculation already reshaping the outcome. A deal lost was not failure. A mistake avoided was leverage. And tonight, the difference between the two had been a single voice no one had planned for. He turned slightly, his attention returning to Naomi, who had already begun to step back, instinct guiding her toward invisibility again now that the moment had passed. She reached for a glass near the edge of the table, her movements precise, professional, as if resetting the room could also reset her place in it. "Wait," Ethan said. Not loud. Not commanding. But enough to stop her. Naomi paused, her hand still resting lightly on the stem of the glass. For a second, she did not turn. Not out of defiance, but out of habit. People like him did not speak to people like her unless something had gone wrong. And something had gone wrong. Just not in the way anyone expected. Slowly, she turned back. Ethan closed the distance between them by a step, not enough to invade her space, but enough to make it clear that this conversation was not casual. "You said you lived in Seoul," he said. "What were you doing there?" Naomi hesitated, just briefly, not because she did not know the answer, but because she was deciding how much of it mattered here. "Studying," she said. "International business." Language immersion program. Ethan's expression did not change, but his attention sharpened. And now you are here, he said, glancing subtly at the uniform, the tray, the role that did not align with what she had just revealed. Naomi followed his gaze for a fraction of a second, then met his eyes again. Now I am working, she said simply. There was no apology in it. No explanation offered beyond what was necessary. Ethan nodded once, slowly. He had built entire teams out of less information than that. He understood what was not being said. Opportunity did not always follow ability. And sometimes, ability learned to wait in places where no one thought to look for it. Behind them, the staff began to move more freely now, clearing the remains of a night that had shifted direction without warning. Soft footsteps. Quiet exchanges. The rhythm of service returning, even if the energy had changed. Victor was nowhere near the table anymore. He had positioned himself near the exit, speaking quietly into his phone, his posture controlled, but his absence from the immediate space noticeable. Ethan did not look at him. Not yet. Some conversations required distance before they could be handled correctly. You stopped me from making a very expensive mistake, Ethan said, his voice even, but carrying a weight that did not need emphasis. Naomi did not respond right away. She had not stepped forward for recognition. She had stepped forward because the truth had been wrong, and leaving it wrong had not been an option she could live with. You would have found out, she said. Ethan shook his head slightly. Not before it mattered, he replied. That was the difference. Timing. In business, timing was everything. And tonight, her timing had changed the outcome of something that had been moving toward inevitability. He studied her again, not as a curiosity now, but as a decision forming in real time. Do you plan on staying here? He asked. The question hung between them, simple on the surface, but carrying layers beneath it. Naomi understood that. She did not answer immediately. She glanced once more at the room, at the tables, at the path she had walked all evening without being seen. Then back at him. I plan on doing my job, she said. Ethan let a small breath out, something close to a quiet acknowledgement. You already did more than that, he said. And for the first time that night, the space between them no longer felt defined by roles, but by something else entirely. Not status. Not position. Value. The kind that does not ask to be recognized, but changes everything when it is. The staff began restoring the room as if nothing had happened, as if a $300 million decision had not just unraveled between courses. Plates disappeared. Glasses were replaced. The quiet choreography of service resumed, smooth and practiced, designed to erase disruption before it could settle into memory. Naomi turned slightly, ready to step back into that rhythm, to let the moment dissolve the way moments like this always did for people in her position. But Ethan did not move away. He stayed where he was, watching not just what she had done, but how quickly she was willing to disappear after doing it. That, more than anything, caught his attention. You knew, he said, his voice low, steady, not a question but something closer to realization. Naomi paused, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table. I heard enough, she replied. Ethan shook his head slightly. No, he said. You understood enough. There was a difference. Hearing was passive. Understanding required something else entirely. Training. Discipline. Experience. He had built his career on that difference. And now he was standing in front of someone who had applied it without title, without recognition, without permission. He glanced briefly toward the exit where Victor had been standing. The space was empty now. That told him everything he needed to know about timing. About awareness. About who in the room had truly been paying attention. When he looked back at Naomi, his tone shifted, not softer, but more direct. Why did you step in? He asked. It was not suspicion. It was precision. Naomi met his gaze, steady, unflinching. Because it was wrong, she said. No hesitation. No calculation. Just truth. Ethan held that answer for a moment, turning it over the same way he would a contract clause, searching for anything beneath it. There was nothing hidden there. No angle. No gain. Just a decision made in real time. That was rare. Rare enough to matter. You could have stayed silent, he said. Naomi gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Yes. And nothing would have changed for you, he continued. Your shift would have ended. You would have gone home. No risk. Naomi's expression did not shift. That is not true, she said. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly, inviting the explanation without asking for it directly. Naomi took a breath, not deep, not dramatic, just enough to steady the words as they came. If I stayed silent, she said, then I would have known. The sentence hung there, simple, but heavier than anything that had been said at the table earlier. Ethan understood it immediately. Not the words themselves, but the weight behind them. The kind of weight that does not show up on balance sheets, but changes decisions just the same. He nodded once, slower this time. And that mattered more than the consequences, he said. Naomi did not answer. She did not need to. The answer had already been given. Around them, the room continued its quiet recovery, but the space between them remained unchanged, still holding the moment that had separated them from everything else happening around them. Ethan shifted his stance slightly, his posture no longer that of a man closing a deal, but of someone recognizing an opportunity that had not been planned. What you did tonight, he said, that is not something I can ignore. Naomi's grip on the tray tightened just slightly, not from fear, but from awareness. This was the point where things changed again. Not the deal. Not the room. The direction. I am not asking for anything, she said. Ethan allowed a faint, almost amused breath to escape. That is exactly why this matters, he replied. There was no rush in his voice. No pressure. Just certainty forming in the same controlled way everything else in his world did. He glanced once more at the table, at the unsigned contract, at the outcome that had nearly been locked in. Then back at her. People spend years trying to build the kind of awareness you showed in a few minutes, he said. And most of them never get there. Naomi said nothing. She had never thought of it that way. For her, it had not been awareness. It had been instinct shaped by experience, by paying attention when no one expected her to. Ethan took a step back this time, not to create distance, but to see the situation more clearly, the way he always did before making a decision that mattered. Finish your shift, he said. Do it the way you planned to. Naomi nodded once, unsure where this was leading, but certain that it was not ending here. Ethan adjusted his jacket again, the same precise motion as before, but now it carried a different meaning. Not control over a deal. Control over what came next. And as Naomi turned to return to her work, the room no longer felt the same. Not because it had changed, but because she had. The room moved on, but Ethan Caldwell did not. Even as conversations resumed in low tones and the quiet rhythm of service restored the illusion of normalcy, his attention stayed fixed on something that did not belong to the evening's original plan. He watched Naomi as she returned to her work, not with curiosity anymore, but with intent. She moved the same way she had before, precise, efficient, unnoticed by everyone except him now. A glass refilled. A plate cleared. A napkin adjusted by less than an inch. The same actions. The same role. But no longer the same meaning. Because once you see value, you cannot unsee it. Ethan stepped away from the table and walked toward the far end of the room, his pace unhurried, his expression unchanged. To anyone else, it looked like a man taking a call or giving space after a negotiation. But in his mind, the numbers had already shifted. Not the ones on the contract. The ones that measured risk. Judgment. People. He had trusted Victor Hahn with millions of dollars worth of interpretation. Years of experience. Flawless credentials. A reputation built on precision. And yet, tonight, that trust had nearly cost him everything. Not because Victor lacked skill, but because Ethan had stopped questioning. He had assumed accuracy where there should have been verification. An assumption, in his world, was the most expensive mistake a person could make. He reached the window, the city stretching out beneath him in sharp lines of light and shadow. New York did not pause for anything. Not deals. Not mistakes. Not moments like this. It moved forward, always. Ethan rested one hand lightly against the glass, his reflection staring back at him, composed, controlled, but sharper now. More aware. Behind him, the door opened quietly and then closed again. He did not need to turn to know who it was. "Sir," Victor's voice came, careful, measured, but missing something it had carried earlier. Certainty. Ethan did not respond immediately. He let the silence settle, not as punishment, but as space. Then he turned, slowly, his gaze steady. "How long?" he asked. Victor hesitated, just enough to confirm that the question had landed exactly where it was meant to. "I am not sure what you mean," he replied. Ethan held his eyes. "How long have you been adjusting translations?" The words were calm. Direct. Without accusation, but impossible to misunderstand. Victor exhaled quietly, his composure still intact, but thinner now, like glass under pressure. "It was never about deception," he said. "Only positioning. Negotiations require framing. You know that." Ethan took a step closer, not aggressive, not confrontational, but deliberate. "Framing is not changing ownership terms," he said. "Framing does not turn control into partnership." Victor's jaw tightened slightly. The deal was still favorable, he insisted. Long term, it could have been managed. Ethan shook his head once. "That is not your decision to make." The distinction was clear. Authority. Boundaries. Trust. Victor understood it. The room felt smaller for a moment, not physically, but in weight. In consequence. Ethan did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You are done here," he said. Simple. Final. Victor did not argue. Not because he agreed, but because he recognized the tone. The decision had already been made. He gave a small nod, controlled, professional even in exit, and turned toward the door without another word. When it closed behind him, the silence that followed was different from before. Not uncertain. Not tense. Clear. Clean. Resolved. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, then turned back toward the room. His gaze found Naomi again, this time faster, more direct. She was near the edge of the space now, finishing what remained of her shift, unaware of the decision that had just been made behind her. Or perhaps aware, but not. Assuming it mattered to her. Ethan adjusted his jacket once more, the motion automatic, but the meaning no longer the same. He was not preparing to leave. He was preparing to act. And as he started walking back toward her, the difference between who she had been an hour ago and who she was now was not measured in status. It was measured in impact. She had changed the outcome of a deal. Now, she was about to change something else entirely. Naomi was placing the final glass back onto a polished tray when she felt it before she heard it, the subtle shift in presence that comes when someone important chooses to stand still instead of pass by. She did not look up immediately. Habit had taught her that eye contact was not always welcome, especially with people who carried authority as effortlessly as tailored fabric. But this time, the silence did not move on. It stayed. "Naomi," Ethan said, not loudly, not sharply, but with clarity that cut through the quiet rhythm of the room. She turned then, slowly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. The distance between them was smaller now, but the difference was not physical. It was something else. Something that had shifted beneath the surface of everything that had happened. "Are you finished for the night?" he asked. Naomi glanced briefly at the clock mounted near the service station. 10 minutes. That was all that remained of her shift. Almost, she said. Ethan nodded once, as if that detail mattered more than it seemed. Good, he replied. Then I will wait. The words landed softly, but they did not belong in a place like this. People like him did not wait. Not for servers. Not for anyone whose name had not been printed on the contract. Naomi felt the weight of the difference, even if she did not show it. She gave a small nod and turned back to finish what she had started, her movement steady, but now aware of something watching, not critically, but deliberately. Every step she took carried a new kind of attention, not from the room, but from him. The last table was cleared. The final plate removed. The quiet exchange with the manager confirmed her shift had ended. And then, for the first time that night, Naomi removed herself from the rhythm of service completely. No tray. No task. No movement designed to disappear. She stood still. Ethan had not moved far. He remained near the edge of the room, just outside the center of attention, but impossible to miss if you knew where to look. When she approached, he straightened slightly, not out of formality, but acknowledgement. Walk with me, he said. Not a command. Not a request. Something in between. Naomi hesitated for half a second, then nodded. Together, they moved toward the private hallway that led away from the main dining floor, the sound of the restaurant fading behind them with each step. The lighting softened there, quieter, more contained. A different kind of space. One where conversations were not meant to be overheard. Ethan stopped near a large window overlooking the city, the skyline stretching out beneath them like a map of decisions and consequences. He turned to face her fully now, no table between them, no roles to anchor the moment. You saved me $300 million tonight, he said. The number did not need emphasis. It carried its own gravity. Naomi did not react the way most people would have. No surprise. No visible shift. Just a steady gaze. I told you what I heard, she said. Ethan allowed a faint, almost incredulous breath to escape. Most people would have stayed quiet, he said. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Most people were not listening, she replied. That answer landed deeper than the number had. Because it was not about money. It was about attention. Awareness. The difference between being present and actually seeing. Ethan studied her for a moment longer, then reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, simple card. No flash. No excess. Just his name. His company. A direct line that very few people ever received. He held it out, not as a gesture of charity, but as something else entirely. Recognition. Come see me tomorrow, he said. 10 a.m. Caldwell Dynamics headquarters. Naomi looked at the card, then back at him. There was no immediate movement to take it. Not hesitation. Consideration. For what? She asked. Ethan's expression did not change, but his answer came without delay. For a conversation that should have happened long before tonight. The hallway remained quiet, the city glowing beyond the glass, the moment balanced between what had been and what could be. And for the first time since she had spoken, Naomi Brooks was no longer standing at the edge of someone else's story. She was standing at the beginning of her own. Naomi did not take the card right away. She looked at it the way someone looks at a door that was never meant to open for them, not with disbelief, but with careful awareness of what stepping through it might mean. The hallway remained quiet, the distant hum of the restaurant now softened into something almost irrelevant, like a world continuing without needing to understand what had just shifted inside it. Ethan did not move his hand. He held the card steady, not insisting, not retracting. Waiting, but not in the way most people waited. There was no impatience in him, only certainty that the moment would resolve itself the way it was meant to. Naomi finally reached out and took it, her fingers brushing the edge lightly before pulling it back toward herself. The card was simple, but it carried weight that had nothing to do with paper. She glanced at the name, then at the address, committing it to memory before lowering her hand again. 10 a.m., she repeated, more to herself than to him. Ethan nodded once. 10 a.m., he confirmed. There was a pause then, not awkward, not uncertain, just a natural space where something unspoken settled between them. Naomi looked up at him again, her expression calm, but thoughtful. You do not know anything about me, she said. Ethan allowed a faint, almost knowing look to cross his face. I know enough, he replied. Naomi tilted her head slightly. You know what I did in one moment, she said. That is not the same thing. Ethan did not argue. He did not dismiss her point. Instead, he stepped closer to the window, glancing out at the city for a brief second before speaking again. You saw what no one else saw, he said. You spoke when it was easier not to. And you were right. He turned back to her, his gaze steady. In my world, that is not a small thing. That is everything. Naomi held his words for a moment, weighing them the way she had weighed her own decision earlier that night. This was not about opportunity alone. It was about alignment. About whether the person offering it understood what had actually happened, or just the outcome it produced. And if I come tomorrow, she said, what changes? Ethan did not hesitate. That depends on you, he answered. There was no promise in his voice. No guarantee. Just possibility, presented without decoration. Naomi looked down at the card again, then back at him. I did not step in for this, she said. Ethan nodded. I know, he replied. That is why this matters. The answer was simple, but it carried the same clarity as everything else he had said. No pressure. No expectation. Just recognition of cause and effect, a value meeting opportunity at the exact moment it was meant to. Naomi slipped the card into the pocket of her uniform, the motion small, but decisive. 10 a.m., she said again, this time with intention. Ethan gave a slight nod, satisfied not because she had agreed, but because she had chosen. I will see you then, he said. For a moment longer, neither of them moved. Then Naomi turned, heading back toward the main floor, toward the exit, toward a night that was ending the same way it had begun on the surface, but entirely different underneath. Ethan remained where he was, watching her go, not as someone leaving a room, but as someone stepping into something larger than the space could hold. The city outside continued to move, light shifting, traffic flowing, decisions being made in offices and apartments and quiet corners no one would ever see. But somewhere between one conversation and the next, something had already changed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough. Because power does not always come from where people expect it. And sometimes, the person who changes everything is the one no one thought to listen to until it was almost too late.